CEO Laura Whitman's voice rang out sharply across the open workspace, cutting through every other sound like a knife. She stood facing Ethan Miller, a stack of internal procedure documents in her hand, her expression visibly irritated as she looked at the system he had just finished handling. "I don't care what you think you were saving," Laura said, her tone calm but heavy with pressure. "Here, we work by procedure, not by personal instinct." Ethan, a night shift maintenance worker, stood frozen in place, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, his uniform stained with dust and sweat after hours of non-stop work. He knew he hadn't followed the instructions posted on the wall, but he also knew that if he had followed every step exactly, the entire system would have shut down 10 minutes earlier. Laura stepped closer, deliberately raising her voice so everyone in the area could hear, labeling Ethan's actions as undisciplined and a potential risk to the company. Eyes around them immediately turned toward him, some curious, some annoyed, but most of all, filled with the familiar silence. No one spoke up on his behalf. Ethan lowered his head. He didn't argue, he didn't explain. He was used to being seen as someone who always strayed from the mold. In that brief moment, the image of his young daughter at home flashed through his mind, along with the reminder that he needed to be back in time for her evening medication. Laura ended with a short, cold sentence. "Don't make me say this a second time." The air froze, and the first conflict officially began. Ethan Miller left the building after night had fully fallen. The fluorescent lights behind him flickered off one by one, leaving behind a cold, silent emptiness. He zipped up his jacket and walked briskly toward the parking lot, where his old sedan sat awkwardly between the newer cars belonging to senior management. No one said goodbye. No one asked if his shift had gone well. Ethan was used to that. He wasn't invisible, but he was always treated as if his presence didn't really matter, as if nothing would change whether he was there or not. On the way home, Ethan stopped at his usual pharmacy. He glanced at his watch, calculating every minute. If he got home too late, his daughter would take her medication late. If he stayed too long, dinner would once again be nothing more than reheated leftovers. He chose quickly, paid, and continued driving in silence. Ethan's apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old apartment block. No elevator. He climbed the stairs step by step, his legs heavy but his pace steady, like a habit carved deep into his body. When he opened the door, the faint smell of cold chicken soup lingered in the air. "I'm home," he said softly. Emily, his daughter, looked up from her homework. She was 10 years old, thinner than most of her classmates, her face slightly pale, but her eyes always lit up when she saw her father. "You're later than usual," she said. "No complaint. Just an observation." "I'm sorry," Ethan replied, setting his bag down. Something came up at work. He didn't say more. He rarely did. Ethan helped her take her medicine, checked her breathing, and only then went into the kitchen to reheat the food. While waiting, he leaned against the sink and looked down at his hands. Faint scars ran along his fingers, a few old burn marks around his wrist. They weren't from accidents at his current job. They had been there for a long time, remnants of a life he no longer talked about. At the company, Ethan was just a maintenance worker. No impressive title, no framed degrees on the wall, no success stories to share during lunch breaks. He arrived on time, worked quietly, and handled the things no one else wanted to touch. When a system broke down, they called him. When everything was stable again, they forgot him just as quickly as they had remembered his name. Ethan had never tried to change that. He had learned to make himself small, learned not to stand out, learned to let others believe he only followed orders. Because every time he did more than expected, every time he reacted faster than what was considered normal, trouble followed. Like today, Laura Whitman's voice still echoed in his head, not because she had spoken loudly, but because every word had been chosen to wound. Not following procedure, lack of discipline, dangerous. Ethan understood procedure. He understood it very well. But he also understood the situations where procedure was too slow to save anyone. He sat down beside his daughter and helped Emily work through a difficult math problem. She frowned, then smiled when she found the solution. "You always know, Dad," Emily said. Ethan smiled back, but something inside him sank. He didn't always know. He had simply learned once to know, in order to survive. The next morning, the office space. White light. The hum of machines. Ethan arrived earlier than usual, not because he feared being reprimanded, but because it was an old habit. Coming in early allowed him to observe the entire system before people began to flood in. He liked those quiet moments, when everything still felt within his control. Laura Whitman arrived 15 minutes after him. She entered with a brisk, decisive stride, her phone pressed to her ear, a perfectly tailored suit, high heels tapping rhythmically against the floor. Laura didn't look around, and she didn't need to. The space automatically made room for her. Ethan stood beside the control panel, reviewing the system parameters. He sensed her presence before he heard her voice. "You," Laura said, ending the call and turning directly toward him. "I want to talk." It wasn't a request. It was an order. They stood less than 2 meters apart. Laura looked at the screen, then at him. "I reviewed last night's report," she said. "You skipped 3 mandatory inspection steps." Ethan took a short breath. "If I had completed all 3 steps, the system would have overloaded," he replied, his voice low, not defiant. "That's not the point," Laura cut in. "Procedures exist to prevent errors, not for you to modify at will." Ethan looked at her. In Laura's eyes, he saw no curiosity, only defense. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask how the system had responded. She only saw what deviated from the manual. "You weren't here last night," Ethan said slowly. "You didn't see the initial voltage drop." Laura frowned. "Are you saying I don't understand my own company's operations?" The question hung in the air, carrying an unspoken warning. Ethan shook his head. "No. I'm saying the situation didn't match the examples in the documentation." "And you think you have the authority to decide?" Laura asked. The air tightened. People nearby pretended to be busy, but their ears were tuned to the conversation. Ethan remained silent for a few seconds. He had stood in rooms far more pressurized than this. He had faced people with real power over life and death, but he knew that here, one wrong sentence could cost him his job, and losing his job meant losing the stability Emily needed. "I believe my responsibility is to keep the system running," Ethan said at last. Laura let out a soft laugh, completely devoid of humor. "No. Your responsibility is to follow instructions." She stepped closer, her voice lower but sharper. "Do you know what concerns me most, Ethan? Not mistakes, but people who think they're better than the system." Ethan met her gaze. For a very brief moment, Laura felt uncomfortable, not because of defiance, but because his eyes were too calm. No fear, no pleading. "I don't want to have this conversation again," Laura said. "Next time, you follow procedure. Is that clear?" "Clear," Ethan replied. Laura turned away immediately, as if the exchange were over. For her, it was. For Ethan, it wasn't. He stood there a few seconds longer, listening to her footsteps fade. Old memories stirred quietly in his mind, times when he had been forced to choose between doing things by the book and doing what was necessary. Times when the consequences didn't come from making the wrong decision, but from doing the right thing. Too late. Ethan returned to his work. He documented everything, more carefully than usual. But deep down, he knew one thing. This misunderstanding wasn't personal. It was a collision between 2 worlds. One world that believed in procedure as a way to control fear, and another that had learned to trust experience in order to survive. The CEO's office. Glass, steel, cold light, the city below. Laura Whitman stood with her back to the window, looking down at the stream of traffic beneath her like a miniature model. Everything moved within lanes, obeyed traffic lights, followed clear rules. That was the world she trusted. A world where order was the only way to control risk. She turned her chair, opened her laptop, and reviewed the incident report from the night before. The line "deviation from standard procedure" was highlighted in red. Laura lingered on it longer than necessary, not because she doubted the finding, but because it confirmed a long-held fear of hers. There were always individuals who believed they were exceptions. Laura didn't hate Ethan Miller. She couldn't even clearly remember his face until last night. But she hated people like him, those who acted on instinct, who relied on experience, something that couldn't be measured, couldn't be standardized, and most importantly, couldn't be controlled. She had learned this lesson early in her career. Years ago, when Laura was still a mid-level manager, a subordinate's flexible decision had cost the company millions of dollars. The media called it human error. The executive board called it a failure of oversight. The person ultimately held responsible was Laura. No one cared about context. They only cared about outcomes. From that day on, Laura made a vow to herself. Emotion would never be allowed to override procedure. She built the image of a CEO who was firm, rational, unyielding. She believed leadership wasn't about inspiration, it was about eliminating variables. People were variables. And people like Ethan, those who didn't stay within predefined lines, were the most dangerous variables of all. Laura took a sip of her now cold coffee, her eyes still fixed on the screen. She didn't see a maintenance worker trying to keep the system alive. She saw a breach in organizational discipline. And to Laura, that breach had to be sealed immediately. Her phone vibrated. A message from operations. Secondary load levels rising abnormally. Monitoring mode activated. Laura exhaled slowly. Follow procedure, she typed back. No independent action. She leaned back in her chair, certain she had done the right thing. Because if procedure wasn't enough, then the entire system had been flawed from the very beginning. The basement technical area. Low, heavy sounds. Flickering lights. Ethan was inspecting a circuit board when he sensed the change before any alarm sounded. The compressor's rhythm was no longer steady. The room temperature rose ever so slightly, a detail most sensors would take several more minutes to register. He looked up. "This isn't right," he muttered. A young technician ran over. "The control panel shows an increase in secondary load," the kid said. "But according to procedure, we have to wait for confirmation from Central." Ethan glanced at his watch. Then at the graph line beginning to curve upward in a way he had seen far too many times before. "If we wait," Ethan said, "well, lose the auxiliary cooling system." But the technician hesitated. The CEO said we're not allowed to act independently. A metallic screech cut through the air, sharp and piercing. Lights in the distance flickered off, then back on. A faint burning smell spread through the room. Ethan didn't wait any longer. He pulled on his gloves and stepped to the auxiliary control panel, his hands moving fast but precise. He cut a load branch, rerouting the energy flow along a configuration that didn't exist in any of the manuals posted on the wall. "What are you doing?" someone shouted. "Stopping it from spreading," Ethan replied curtly. The scene descended into chaos. Alarms blared. People ran back and forth, making calls, filing reports, waiting for instructions. Ethan didn't. He focused on what was in front of him, numbers, sounds, signs, that only someone who had once faced life and death situations could recognize. A spark shot from the corner of the circuit panel. Ethan stepped back half a pace, adjusted the parameters, locked the auxiliary valve. The screeching softened. The temperature stabilized. Then the main system went down. Not in an explosion, not an instant catastrophe, but in a deadly silence. Screens went black. Fans stopped. The air felt heavy as lead. "We've lost the system," someone whispered. Ethan stood still, his eyes sweeping the space. He knew this moment. The moment after everything had gone wrong, and people began looking for someone to blame. His phone vibrated. A message from Central Operations. Why was the auxiliary branch cut before approval was granted? Ethan didn't reply immediately. Upstairs, Laura Whitman was in the middle of a meeting when the lights went out. The large screen behind her turned black. A murmur rippled through the room. "What's happening?" a board member asked. Laura shot to her feet. "Activate emergency protocol," she said. "Who's responsible for the technical area?" A name was spoken. Ethan Miller. Laura froze for a fraction of a second. Then her jaw tightened. "Bring him up here," she said. Immediately. Ethan stepped out of the elevator into the brightly lit glass corridor. The burnt smell was gone, but the tension wasn't. He knew exactly what was waiting for him. Laura stood at the center of the conference room, surrounded by tense faces. She turned when she saw Ethan. "What did you do?" she asked, without preamble. Ethan met her gaze. "I stopped an incident from spreading." "By taking down the entire system?" Laura snapped. "If I hadn't," Ethan replied, "we would have had a fire." The room fell silent. Laura let out a thin smile. "You expect me to trust your intuition over data?" Ethan drew a deep breath. In his mind, an image of Emily flickered, sitting at home, waiting for him to return. He knew that if this conversation went the wrong way, everything he had built for her would collapse. "No," he said slowly. "I expect you to trust the outcome." Laura looked at him. For the first time, she didn't respond immediately. Beyond the glass walls, the city continued to function. But inside, faith in absolute procedure had just developed a crack. The main system was down, but that was only the beginning. Auxiliary screens began to flicker, clusters of data appearing and disappearing. The air in the room grew thick. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. If the backup system wasn't activated correctly within 30 minutes, the entire center would be forced to shut down for at least 2 days. Those 2 days wouldn't just be numbers on a report. They meant canceled contracts, a paralyzed supply chain, thousands of people affected. And most importantly, they meant the executive board would have to answer questions no procedure could shield them from. Laura Whitman stood in the middle of the room, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. The responses she received offered none of her usual certainty. We're waiting for confirmation. According to procedure, we need approval from upper management. There isn't enough data to intervene at that level. Laura clenched her hand. The very phrases that normally anchored her now felt like restraints. Ethan stood in a corner of the room, silently observing. He didn't step in. He knew this moment, the moment when everyone still hoped the system would save itself. A senior engineer turned to Ethan, his voice low. If the auxiliary cooling system doesn't come online in 15 minutes, we'll lose the basement as well. Ethan nodded. I know. Is there a way? The man asked. Ethan looked up at the ceiling, as if calculating something in his head. There is, he said. But it's not in the procedure. The words landed like a spark. Laura spun around. No, she said immediately. We can't. You can stop me. Ethan cut in, his voice not loud but unmistakably clear. But you can't stop physics? Laura froze. The room went dead silent. Ethan walked to a secondary display and pointed to an old schematic rarely used. This system was designed to handle temporary overload in emergency situations, but it's locked out because of long-term risk. What risk? Laura asked. If the calculations are wrong, Ethan replied, we permanently damage part of the infrastructure. Laura swallowed. And if we don't do it? We lose everything, Ethan said. Laura looked around the room, faces waiting, anxious. No one offered an alternative. No one dared commit to anything beyond waiting. For the first time in years, Laura realized she was facing a decision with no manual. There was no procedure for this moment. How long do you need? She asked. 10 minutes, Ethan answered. And I need full authority. The words made Laura hesitate. Full authority, the very thing she had spent her entire career avoiding. Outside the glass walls, rain began to fall. Drops struck the glass like a countdown. Laura took a deep breath. You have 5 minutes, she said. I'll take responsibility. It wasn't just a decision. It was a rupture of old belief. Ethan said nothing more. He went to work immediately. His fingers moved fast, precise, as if he had done this hundreds of times before. Commands not found in any manual were entered. Restricted parameters were unlocked. A technician whispered, Hess working like Hess been in worse situations than this. Laura heard it. She didn't respond. The screens flickered one last time, then stabilized. The auxiliary cooling system came online, slowly but steadily. The temperature began to drop. A collective sigh of relief spread through the room. We held it, someone said. Ethan leaned lightly against the table and exhaled. His thoughts weren't on success but on Emily, who was probably eating dinner alone by now. Silence settled in. The conference room gradually emptied, until only Laura and Ethan remained. Laura looked at the now stable display, then at Ethan. Her voice no longer carried its earlier sharpness. Only fatigue and a question she had never asked before. How did you know what to do? She said. Ethan slowly removed his gloves. Because I've been in situations where waiting for approval meant people would die. Laura frowned. You're talking about? My past, Ethan said. A part of my life I don't bring with me to work here. Laura fell silent. She recalled the calm in his eyes during every confrontation, not indifference, but the calm of someone who had already accepted loss. I thought leadership was about controlling everything, Laura said slowly, almost like a confession. Eliminating every variable. Ethan looked at her. People are always variables, he said. The question is whether you treat them as risks or as resources. The words struck something deep within Laura. She thought back to the early years of her career when she too had trusted people before being wounded by the consequences. I boxed you in, she said, just because you didn't fit the kind of people I was used to managing. Ethan nodded. You're not the first. Laura gave a soft laugh, devoid of joy. And I almost became the one who brought everything down because I was too afraid to trust. She looked out the window. The rain had eased. The city was moving again. You know, Laura said, I always thought strong leadership meant never hesitating. Ethan replied, Strong leadership means knowing when to listen. Laura turned back to him, this time, not with the eyes of a CEO looking at an employee, but of one human being looking at another. "You saved the system today," she said. Ethan shook his head. "I just did my job." Laura pressed her lips together. "No. You did what I couldn't. You trusted experience instead of fear." She paused for a moment. "And I think I need to learn that." Late afternoon. Soft golden light spilled through the glass panels. The building had returned to its familiar rhythm. Machines hummed steadily. Hallway lights glowed evenly. No alarms remained. Everything looked as if a crisis had never happened a few hours earlier. But for those who had been in that conference room today, nothing looked the same anymore. Ethan packed up his tools, as carefully as always. He didn't linger for praise, nor did he seek recognition. For him, finishing the job meant getting home on time. Emily was still waiting. "Ethan." Laura Whitman's voice came from behind him, no longer sharp. "Just a normal call." He turned. "Could you spare a few minutes?" she asked. Ethan nodded. They didn't go back into the large conference room. Laura led him to a smaller space, dimmer, without a long table dividing them. She closed the door slowly, as if she didn't want this conversation to become an official meeting. "I've been thinking a lot," Laura began. "Not just about today, but about how I run this place." Ethan stood still, listening. "I've always believed that if I controlled things tightly enough, I could prevent every mistake," Laura continued. "But today, I realized I built a system where people are never allowed to be better than the procedure." She looked him straight in the eye. "That isn't leadership," she said. "That's fear." The words landed in the middle of the room, not dramatic, but honest. Ethan replied slowly. "Fear makes people cling to what feels familiar." Laura gave a small smile. "And I've been holding on too tightly." She took a deep breath. "I want you to stay." Ethan didn't look surprised. He had anticipated the offer. "Not just stay," Laura continued, as if reading his thoughts. "I want you to help me change how we work here. Not to tear procedures apart, but to teach us when flexibility matters." Ethan was silent for a long moment. What filled his mind wasn't career advancement or recognition. It was Emily's daily routine. The evenings he needed to be home, the stability his daughter needed more than anything else. "I'm not looking for a title," he said, "and I don't want to be pushed into a role that costs me my family." Laura nodded immediately. "I understand." She paused, then added, her voice firmer. "This isn't an offer of power. It's an offer of partnership. You'll have a voice, not a burden." Ethan looked at her. For the first time, he didn't see a defensive CEO but a person learning how to trust. "I'll think about it," he said. Laura didn't press him. "Whatever you decide," she said. "I still owe you a thank you. Not just for the system, but for the lesson." Evening. Ethan's small apartment. Emily was sitting on the floor, putting together a puzzle. She looked up when she heard the door open. "You're home early," Emily said, smiling. "Yeah," Ethan replied. "I promised today." He sat down beside her, helping fit the remaining pieces together. Warm light fell over the two of them, completely different from the cold office lighting just hours earlier. "Dad," Emily asked softly, "did something happen at work today?" Ethan paused for a second. "There was a little trouble." "Were you scared?" Ethan thought of the conference room, of decisions made in minutes, of Laura's eyes when she was forced to trust him. Then he looked at his daughter. "Yes," he said honestly. "But I didn't run away." Emily nodded, as if that was exactly the answer she needed. "You always do the right thing," she said. Ethan smiled. He didn't correct her. Some childhood beliefs deserved to remain untouched. The next morning, Ethan returned to the company. There was no big announcement, no system-wide email, but there were small changes. Laura didn't go straight to her office. She stopped by the technical area, asking questions, listening not to audit, but to understand. When someone proposed an action outside procedure, she didn't shut it down immediately. She asked, "Why?" Those questions rippled outward. Ethan was invited into discussions not as the one who saved the day, but as someone sharing experience. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened, not because of a title but because of the calm he carried. Laura observed from a distance. She realized something she had never allowed herself to see before. Leadership isn't about standing above and controlling, it's about creating space for others to perform at their best. That was transformational leadership, not forcing compliance, but changing how people think and act. Afternoon. Emily's school. Ethan stood waiting for his daughter at dismissal. Laura Whitman approached, no suit, no high heels, just an ordinary woman after work. "Have you decided?" she asked. Ethan watched Emily running out through the school gate. Emily saw him and waved. "I'll stay," Ethan said. "On one condition." Laura smiled. "I'm listening." "I don't want this place to change just because of me," he said. "I want it to change because of people." Laura nodded. "That's exactly what I want to learn too." Emily ran over and took Ethan's hand. "Dad, can we go home now?" "Yeah," Ethan replied. Laura looked at the two of them, then said softly, "You're a good father." Ethan looked down at his daughter. "That's the most important job I've ever had." Ethan Miller's story doesn't end with a new title or a victory celebrated with applause. It ends with a peaceful afternoon. A father picking up his daughter from school on time, no longer carrying the fear that everything might collapse tomorrow. And it is that quiet peace that he sacrificed his past to protect. In modern society, we are used to judging people by resumes, procedures, job titles, and what can be measured. We believe that if everything is standardized tightly enough, mistakes will disappear. But this story reminds us that some of the most important moments in life exist outside any procedure. They live in experience, in resilience, and in the courage to make decisions when no one else is willing to take responsibility. Ethan is not a hero because he saved a system. He is a hero because he chose to be a true father even when that choice led to misunderstanding, being underestimated, and living in silence for many years. And Laura Whitman did not become a better leader because she learned a new procedure, but because she learned to trust people even when doing so forced her to confront her deepest fear. Perhaps the greatest lesson here is not about who was right or who was wrong. It lies in the question, when you have power, do you use it to control or to uplift? When you stand before another human being, do you see risk or potential? Out there are many Ethans, fathers, mothers, ordinary people, carrying extraordinary stories that no one ever asks about. If we slow down, listen, and look beyond the surface, we may not only save a system, but also preserve the dignity of a human being. And if you choose to stay here, you will hear many more stories like this. Stories that are quiet, unshowy, but human enough to heal, and honest enough to remind us that sometimes the greatest strength is not controlling everything, but choosing kindness when we have the power to harm.